The blockbuster movie machine is just that. A machine. A business run by people who know which hoops to jump through to get the optimum result. But just because a lot of these movies seem to be designed by committee doesn't mean that there's no room for spontaneity. After all, not everybody sticks to the script 100% of the time. Take the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A well-oiled machine, yes. But actors are actors, and actors are gonna riff.
This all seems like big time. You know, huge superhero kind of stuff.
Today we're gonna go back through some scenes featuring your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, which you may not have realized were improvised.
Anybody care about what I want?
I do.
Shut up. Get out.
Now, while this first entry doesn't technically appear in the final cut of Captain America: Civil War, it's a good example of the kind of spontaneous energy Tom Holland has brought to the character of Peter Parker. You remember the first time we saw his version of Peter, right? Arriving back at his apartment, jaw dropping to the floor at the sight of Tony Stark schmoozing Aunt May? Well, Holland and Robert Downey Jr. played a version of that scene for one of Holland's auditions. The kid was competing against 6 other potential Peter Parkers as part of a grueling months-long process. And his agent gave him one important piece of advice. Whatever you do, don't improvise during the audition. Not bad advice, and we think you'll agree. Playing it safe seems sensible. But then the famously unpredictable Downey Jr. started improvising, so Holland decided to do the same. And their sparky, high-energy dynamic sealed the deal. The rest is MCU history. Sticking with that same scene in Civil War, and a brief exchange that is so smooth and natural you probably didn't realize it wasn't scripted. Actors improvise for a host of different reasons. Sometimes they're trying to one-up each other, catch their co-stars out with a new line. Sometimes they just don't like the dialogue that's written, so they decide to try something new to keep the energy up. And sometimes they might slip in a little extra line just to keep the scene on track, but in a way that feels organic. That's exactly what happened here, when Tony Stark tells Peter Parker to move his leg so that he can sit on the bed next to him. It feels very much like what Iron Man would say to young Spidey.
I'm gonna sit here so you move the leg.
But it was actually a case of Robert Downey Jr. trying to get Tom Holland to hit his mark. The young actor wasn't quite sitting in the right place, but rather than stop the scene, Downey Jr. improvised the line. Luckily, Holland went with it. Always the professional. Not all of the unscripted moments in these movies were a case of Tom Holland following Robert Downey Jr.'s lead. RDJ is certainly a master of the riff, but his young co-star can hold his own, and one of the funniest throwaway moments in Spider-Man: Homecoming was actually improvised by Holland. The moment in question is part of a scene in Tony's car, where the off-duty Iron Man gives Peter his new suit and some kind of half-hearted encouragement.
Don't do anything stupid.
At the end of the scene, Tony reaches across to open the door to let Peter out, and Peter moves in for a hug, which is quickly rebuffed. That hug? Improvised. Tom Holland thought it would be a funny addition, and Downey Jr. clearly agreed, adding in some extra lines from Tony's perspective.
Bye.
Is that the last great example of these two sparking off of each other? No, we're not there yet. Now, we all remember our first screening of Infinity War, right? That shell-shocked feeling as Earth's mightiest heroes got their asses comprehensively handed to them by the big purple guy? Well, one of the most emotionally pummeling moments at the end of that movie was born at least partly from improvisation. We're talking, of course, about Spidey's death scene and his anguished "I don't want to go" as a stricken Tony Stark cradles him in his arms. According to Holland, a lot of what we saw on screen came out of unscripted experimentation. Not all of the ideas they came up with worked, but there were a few that they decided to take forward, including the now iconic and devastating "I don't want to go." The reason for the repetition of the line, according to Holland, was part of his process as an actor. He often picks a phrase like that to repeat in his head when he's trying to cry on screen, and in this case, the phrase was "I don't want to go." It made it into the spoken dialogue, and the results are heartbreaking. Excuse me, there's something in my eye. Now, Robert Downey Jr. may be a big kid at heart, but the actual kids in the Spidey movies can riff up a storm on their own. You only have to look at the behind-the-scenes footage of Tom Holland, Jacob Batalon, and Zendaya to see the easy chemistry these young stars have with each other. And we've known since his fantastic second movie, Cop Car, that director John Watts knows how to get great performances out of young actors. Side note, if you haven't watched Cop Car, watch Cop Car. So it's no wonder that Watts was willing to give his young performers the opportunity to play around on set, with excellent results. For example, remember the scene in Spider-Man: Far From Home when Ned walks in on Peter and MJ and the character unsuccessfully tries to improvise his way out of the situation without giving away Peter's secret identity?
The costume looks great.
Part of the reason that scene is so convincing is that Jacob Batalon really was improvising, throwing out new lines left, right, and center for his co-stars to bounce off of. It's actually pretty impressive how much freedom the actors were given on such a huge blockbuster production, as we'll see in the next entry. The chemistry between Mysterio and Spider-Man is one of the most fun and memorable aspects of Spider-Man Far From Home, giving them a hero-villain relationship different from anything else we've seen in the MCU. And a lot of that comes from the relationship between Tom Holland and Jake Gyllenhaal, who immediately bonded when they started working on the film. In fact, their real-life dynamic was so positive that it started to affect the dynamic of the characters in the movie. Mysterio and Peter's relationship was scripted as being much more antagonistic, but the more time the actors spent working on their characters, the more their affection for each other showed up on screen. And rather than asking to dial it back, Jon Watts went with it, following his actor's lead. The result is a fascinating and complex relationship, and it makes Mysterio's ultimate betrayal hit that much harder. It seems that sometimes it's worth trusting your actors. Directors, take note. Oh, and if you haven't seen Tom Holland and Jake Gyllenhaal clowning around on the Far From Home press tour, you know what to search for after you're done watching this video. Of course, Spider-Man is not merely confined to the MCU, and nor is improvisation. Now, it would probably be fair to say that Marc Webb's two amazing Spider-Man movies didn't exactly set the world on fire. And it's a shame, because while those movies definitely had their problems, there was a lot of good stuff in there. Particularly, the casting. Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone played off of each other beautifully, and in the scene where Peter goes to Gwen's house for dinner, veteran comic actor Denis Leary got a chance to shine as well. According to Leary, this scene, one of the first they shot for the movie, was one where Marc Webb gave them a lot of room to improvise.
Yeah, sure, on the internet he's been made out to look like some kind of masked hero or something.
And as the antagonistic back and forth got more and more intense, Leary even found himself having to consciously up his game because Garfield and Stone were so good at improvising. And this guy's a stand-up comedian. High praise indeed.
I think most people would say that he was providing a public service.
Alright, let's face it, Spider-Man 3 isn't gonna be at the top of many best Spider-Man movie lists.
Yeah.
Even director Sam Raimi doesn't particularly like it. But it has its campy charms, and this infamous scene is a guilty pleasure for the ages. Under the influence of the symbiote Venom, Peter Parker turns into a greasy, sassy emo kid, complete with terrible haircut, and for some reason does a lot of bad dancing. Is that something that emo types do? Anyway, you can blame Tobey Maguire and Sam Raimi for the bad dancing. While the basic elements of the scene were choreographed, the director and actor threw in a lot of new ideas of their own to make the dancing as funny and as ridiculous as possible. Is it great? Is it terrible? Is it both? Maybe, but it is certainly memorable. And how's this for seamless improv? During the London Bridge climax of Spider-Man Far From Home, huge chunks of the dialogue from the supporting cast weren't even scripted. It was just them riffing off of each other. Turns out, even with wind machines and explosions going on, actors gonna actor.